I'm Bill Hodges, and this is Spotlight on Government. And we have two great guests today from the Department of Agriculture for the state of Florida. The first of the guests is David Westerfield, Chief of Apiary Inspection, and Mark Dykes, Supervisor of Inspection. You know, guys, talked to Adam Putnam about getting two folks on the program. I didn't know he'd send the biggest guys he had.
We're the linemen.
You're the lineman, without a doubt. Let me quick ask you, David, why did you ever get involved with bees?
Well, it started about 45 years ago. As a young kid, we actually had a beekeeper that had bees on our farm. And so at that time, when I was 6 years old, I started getting interested in them. And from that time on, I've never let off on being, very into beekeeping. So.
Mark, how about you?
My story's a little different. I actually just got into bees about 8 years ago. I worked for the Nature Conservancy for a while doing land management, and after that I was looking for a job and found one at the University of Florida in Dr. Jamie Ellis's lab and absolutely fell in love with it. My family has an agriculture background, so I'd always seen bees, never really worked with them, and delved into it and haven't looked back.
You know, it might be interesting, folks, to wonder why a little bit that we're doing a show on bees. I mean, we've seen bees all our life, but many of you do not know that bees are critical. We have a problem with colony collapse, and if that happens and it continues to happen, we could have a problem with our crops. You'd see increased cost for food, and a lot of other things that you see, your flowers, many things, wouldn't get pollinated. So these two folks are the leading edge on telling us how we're going to prevent that
Colony collapse disorder.
Right. CDD.
CCD. We'll get Bill right on this pretty soon. As Bill actually said, with our agriculture in Florida, there's about a $15 billion industry that 1/3 of that would not get pollinated without the help of commercial beekeepers and your sideliners and niche pollinators throughout the state. Right now, the state of Florida has roughly 3,200 beekeepers with about 360,000 hives of bees that are managed. 360,000 that are managed.
That are managed.
Meaning somebody goes into them about once a month.
Wow. Are there a lot of wild ones too?
Actually, the feral colonies have been depleted through the last about 30 years. We've had two major pests introduced, varroa mites and the tracheomites that came in, both of those back in the mid to later 80s. They wiped out most of our feral colonies.
Is this because they came from another country like a lot of the other things?
Yeah, very much so, especially with the varroa mite, which is currently the biggest pest to the honeybee. It's an Asiatic mite, and the bees in Asia, which are different species, actually have ways of dealing with it, but our European honeybees are brand new to it and they have no way of getting rid of it. So that mite, coupled with the fact that it's a vector, it carries up to 8 different bee diseases, actually 8 known, and they keep finding more, creates a big problem. So for the managed colonies that have no way of dealing with it, it's a big problem. For the feral colonies, it's a big, giant problem because they'll just dwindle away to nothing because of that.
I have a question for you, something you said there. Are European bees?
Yep.
Were there no bees here before Columbus came?
We don't think there were. There is evidence now that there might have been one of the Apis species in the Pleistocene period, but there are no native honeybees. In Florida, though, alone, there's about 317 native bees, and those range everything from solitary bees to semi-social bees, but the honeybee as we know it wasn't here before settlers.
317 different kinds of bees?
Mm-hmm.
Bees as in your small solitary bees, your ones that are not managed throughout typical humans managing them as agricultural needs. Now, bumblebees are one of our other species in there that are managed for pollination of like in greenhouses, for blueberry crops.
Really? Bumblebees?
Yep. Bumblebees. They
the
do
big
not
ones?
The big that ones that sting multiple times.
Yeah.
But they're not managed for honey or anything else except for pollination. The difference in those for pollination you've got about 200 bumblebees in a colony, where you've got 20 to 80,000 worker bees that go out of a regular hive, European hive. That's a managed hive. So
Now, how many hives did you say we had overall?
360,000 managed hives.
With how
And-
many bees in each
Well,
hive, roughly?
most of them will have about 60,000 bees in them.
That's a pretty good bunch of bees.
It's a lot of bees.
And as Mark was bringing up on the other race of bee that's here in Florida, which is the Africanized bee is a more defensive bee. It came in, was actually brought into South America by a doctor down there thinking that he could increase their ability to produce honey in South America. So Dr. Kerr brought in the African race of honeybees, which is also Apis mellifera scutulatus, which it just likes to protect.
You want to
its
say that
hive.
again?
Well, Apis mellifera scutulatus, and it does scoot a lot, as we jokingly say. The way we remember its scientific name is it's more apt to abscond or leave where it's at. So it scoots to different places
Oh,
and
okay.
scoot a lot. So.
Now, African bees have moved north, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We do currently have African bees in Florida. We think they actually came into the ports instead of up and around through Texas
Okay.
and Louisiana. We tend to have those in more the southern areas. We say I-4 is pretty much the cutoff. They can move north of that if
It's
people
too
carry
cold.
hives, that type of thing. That's the thought, is that it's too cold, and also maybe that the vegetation's not right for them. Because anything north of Tampa starts to get into less subtropical, obviously more temperate areas. So you have less food sources for the bees.
Yeah, you know, I noticed that when I moved down from Dayton.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for a place as I moved down, and I kept reading the road signs. And when I finally saw a sign, a road that went over something that did not say bridge freezes before road, I knew I was in the right place.
Where we can produce agriculture pretty much 365 days a year. You think about the African bee, though, actually the one we have here is a hybrid of the two, the European honeybee that was roughly brought in the early 1600s. And there's some argument on where it came into first, because if you look at St. Augustine, they were selling wax and honey during the 1560s.
Okay.
But we don't have any real dated material for the Americas besides 1628 for Florida having bees. They show they came into Grenada in 1622 and then up into here. But we think they may have been brought over earlier with the European settlers into St. Augustine.
Now, the African bee, as I remember, is more like the yellow jacket. It'll attack just for fun.
No, I wouldn't.
No?
I wouldn't say that. Both the African and European bees will defend their nest, their colony.
Okay.
There's actually a age group of bee that's their job. Every bee has a job in the colony, and as they get older, they move out of the hive into the field, into different things. And so the defense bees or the guard bees, as they're referred to, are the ones that guard the hive. Any hive will sting you if they feel threatened. The problem runs into with the African bee or the scutellata is that the defense response, instead of having 10 to 20 bees come out and sting you, they'll send 100 bees.
Oh.
And they will chase you for a longer distance. So
I noticed yellow jackets are like that. I don't
Yeah.
much care for those.
yeah, they're all just trying to protect their home.
Yeah.
Yeah, once they get riled up, the African bee loves to, defend its hive. One thing I will say to the general public is when you see a bee, doesn't matter whether it's a European honeybee or an African honeybee or an Asian honeybee, which Asia does have honeybees. We don't have them here yet. They will not defend that little flower they're on or whatever they're on. They defend and protect their hive.
Hi, okay.
So,
Because I've walked
yeah.
through them
Oh yeah.
in fields, or in fact, last night we were playing cards at someone else's house, and there happened to be bushes there, and I walked right by, and I know I brushed some that were there, but I've never feared the honeybee.
Yeah. Most people don't realize you could be standing within 4 or 5 feet of a hive of bees. As long as you're not in their flight path, you will not disturb them. They've got jobs that they've got to go do that actually is in order for that hive to survive. Every member in that hive has a special job. And all they're worried about is either getting enough food for that hive to survive through the winter time, which we don't have much of here in Florida. But with days shortening, it still affects those bees so that they will live longer than regular times. But they have those jobs. As long as you're not interfering with them, they're sort of like Disney World. They stay going all the time.
Now, how do bees winter? My sister's got 2 hives up there on their farm.
Bees
and it gets really cold up there.
Bees do an excellent job because of their design. If you think about one individual bee, it can't really produce a body temperature, but as a group of bees together,
So
as long as they're clustered together, they'll actually consume honey. They do what's called thermoregulating. They flex a flight muscle and keep that hive warm, maintain, normally if there's brood in the hive, around 96 degrees. If there's no brood, it'll drop down into the 60s and 70s, so optimum temperature.
Yeah, I always tell people it's like, have you ever seen the March of the Penguins, where the penguins form the big ball and they constantly rotate through, and they'll move just a little bit warming, and you add all of the penguins together and they keep it quite warm. Bees do the same thing. If you open a hive in the winter, you'll see a cluster of bees, a very centralized location of bees. And in that, it actually is warm. You can put your hand over it and you can feel the warmth coming out of it.
You can put your head over it.
In situations like that, they do get a little grumpy, but for the most part, working with bees, a lot of people have the misconception that the minute you open that hive, all the bees want to do is sting you. And that's just not true. We use smoke to calm the bees. And what that does is bees communicate by pheromones, so by smell. And so it's very similar to if you've smelled a lot of candles at the Yankee Candle and you smell the coffee, it kind of resets your nose.
Yeah.
Smoke does a similar thing to the bees. It actually blocks the receptors for the pheromones. So the whole hive, if one of them gets alerting, in other words, sending off the alarm pheromone, the whole hive won't notice it because they can't smell it. So once you do that and you can take out the frames and work them, there's many days, especially nice hot sunny days, that you can do that and never get stung.
Yeah, that's our,
That would be
working
my
with
goal.
honeybees, our goal is normally not to get stung. That's why we like to, when we would be at the state fair here in Tampa, we
That's
used
where
to
we
put
first
on,
met.
Yeah, back 10 or 12 years ago, we used to put on our bee beards down there and show people that we could, through manipulating the bees, we could put on a bee beard, a bee hand, whatever we wanted to put on, and show general public that bees are not out there, to lose their life by stinging you.
And they do.
They do.
They do.
It pulls out part of their intestinal tract. When that stinger goes in, it's barbed. And so as that bee leaves you, she leaves the stinger there, and that marks you for another bee to come and sting you. European honeybees aren't as apt to follow through with another 1 or 2 stings, where the African, they will, and that's what sets them off.
Other bees will come sting you.
But they still lose their barb.
They're same, identical. Actually, we have to do what's called
Yellow jacket doesn't, correct?
Most of them don't. There are certain varieties of yellow jackets that are reverting back or whatever. We found actually in this area that will, some reason, lose their stinger, whether their muscle around the back end is loosening up, they will. But
Let's talk a little bit about what's causing this hive collapse. In fact, let's talk a lot about it. What's going on around the world, because it's not just an American problem, I understand.
Colony collapse started in the first time it was reported. They were actually calling it disappearing disease. And there's been throughout the history of beekeeping times when bees have just disappeared out of the hive, going back into the 17 and 1800s since bees have been managed. It occurred here in Florida. First report was 2006, right here in Tampa area. We came down and the bee colonies were totally empty except with 5 or 6 frames of brood, which brood is the young baby larvae and young bees in there. And
they were gone?
No bees, just like some alien had beamed them up, and no bees on the ground, which when you have that, you have no pollination, no honey production. So we got to looking at what was causing it. First thing most beekeepers blame is pesticides right off the bat, because that's the easiest thing or the fastest way of killing off and bees. Once we got to looking heavier and heavier, now we can show that there's a massive amount of viruses that we've identified. We found other bacteria, Nosema, which is a new variety of Nosema, came out of Asia. There's some other problems with possibly genetics. It's in a whole array. It's sort of like a pie. You've got 8 or 9 slices of the pie that we finally dissected out. And all of them relate to bees collapsing and disappearing. If you remove 2 or 3 of them, it seems you have healthier bees. And you can maintain a hive a longer period then. But still, bees are disappearing. We still have that problem.
I'd heard something about fungicides that had come out that Europe had banned or something.
That was a recent study. There is evidence that the application of fungicides and the exposure to fungicides was causing the bees to be more susceptible to Nosema virus, or Nosema, the pathogen. And what was basically happening is they were exposed to it. It wasn't directly killing the bees, but it was providing a pathway for Nosema, which is a microsporidian, to get into their intestines, their midgut, and propagate.
It just as well might be killing.
It could be. And the other thing that they found, a researcher out of, I can't remember what university, Reed Johnson is his name, has found that there's a synergistic effect that exists between pesticides and herbicides, that you could spray 2 different chemicals that have absolutely no effect on the bee, or very little effect. And when they cross, it amplifies it, and it'll become, the synergistic effect becomes very toxic to the bees. They're not able to detoxify themselves, flush it out of their systems. So in that aspect of pesticides, there is a big problem.
The other thing you've got to look at on honeybees, because of their short lifespan and their productive times.
What is their lifespan?
Lifespan's about 42 days during the summer months. When
42 days, is it?
Right.
For one bee.
For one bee. And they all have certain jobs throughout that lifetime. And they normally don't revert back to a job. So the job at the end of their last maybe 2 weeks of their life is gathering nectar and bringing in the food, everything that hive needs, pollination, water. So those bees, anytime you're shortening their life, it's always at the back end that you're taking it off. So your winter bees now, once you start to get into shortening of the daytime or day hours, you'll end up with bees that live to 100, 120 days. They're getting ready to live a lot longer. Here in Florida, because our honey season doesn't end at that time, those bees get to work a lot more, but they may live 80 to 90 days. They work themselves to death. So you're still taking that time off at the very end.
Which removes from both the pollination and from the productivity of the hive.
Exactly.
Correct.
If you think of a hive, I always like to think of a hive not as bees, but as a hive. It's what we refer to as being a superorganism. If you remember back at Star Trek days, the Next Generation, the Borg, which are the collective, everybody works for the good of the collective. I'll make that reference to schools, and I realize how old I am because a lot of times I don't get there.
Get it.
But it's a very apt example, because they really do, like David said earlier, one bee on its own, she's going to last a few days. The entire colony, they last for years and technically live forever. Right. It's just how they reproduce and everything. So when we study bees, we study them in 2 different ways. We study the individual bee, which for colony collapse disorder, it's interesting because we're having to study both. We're having to study how the colony itself reacts, and then how the individual bees, and then try to merge all that information to get a better picture of how the colony is doing. So it's quite complicated. There's a new kind of catchword that we're using now is multifactorial. We've realized that there's not a silver bullet out there that we know of. There could,
might be somewhere.
There could be somewhere, and whoever discovers that's probably going to get a statue made after them. But right now, we kind of think that there's multiple factors: pesticide, breeding, bunch of different stuff.
I understand there is some studies, or at least I've done a little bit of reading on this before I decided that I needed to have you here to explain it to me. That there are some of the crops that are genetically changed that may also be affecting the bees.
Yeah, the GMOs are genetically modified crops that are out there. some of those may be directly affecting the bees. We know that there's like cotton that has Bt, Bacillus thuringiensis. It keeps certain insects from eating or being able to produce on there. It doesn't seem to affect the bees near as much as some of the other chemicals or modified plants out there. So
one of the big things that I think is misconstrued about that a lot of times is there was a big bee die-off in Canada this past year. It involved genetically modified corn that had what they call a seed coating on it. So the corn itself has some genetic modifications to it, but then the seeds are coated with pesticides to allow the plant to get to a height where they can kind of self-sustain before the insects can get to it. Well, the coating that they used on the seeds was a little bit too powdery, and so it created a big dust cloud, and the bees came in contact with that, and it was very detrimental to them. The industry has since fixed that mistake, according to them and according to the reports we've had of planning and stuff. So that, you know, it is kind of a misconception. They're not directly related, but there is a lot of belief that they are, but it's not being shown.
Well, going back to our age, when we used to have some real hard chemicals that were out there, DDT and carbamates and your hard stuff. Most of the chemicals that we're using now are very safe, especially for humans or mammalians. And so a lot of them we're having to look at better techniques of applying them. And also, you know, honeybees, they're on the label. When you look at any of your pesticide labels, it will state on there, cannot use this or apply this chemical during activity when bees would be present. And so those chemicals, we've gone away from some of the harder chemicals, but now we're having to look harder at honeybees to what it affects their, you know, their growth regulators or in the development of the larva or the brood.
May not kill them, but can adjust them.
It's adjusting them so that they don't work like they used to. And those are the problems we're now having to deal with.
What can my audience that's watching today do? Is there anything the average citizen can do?
Absolutely.
To help you guys in this battle to make sure that bees are healthy?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest things is support research. We are very blessed here in Florida to have one of the top labs, University of Florida, Dr. Jamie Ellis's lab, who do a lot of research on bees, a lot of research on pesticide interaction, that type of stuff. But start on your local level. If you're very interested in bees, you know, support local gardens, support planting of pollinator habitats, which will give bees something to eat. If you want to, become a beekeeper.
Sort of like butterfly gardens, only for bees.
Identical.
And butterfly gardens do the same thing as bee gardens. So if you plant one, you're going to be helping everything.
Oh, that's good to know.
And the other thing too is you can become a beekeeper. Florida law is very, very liberal and allows beekeeping in urban areas. That's something that we had just transitioned over, that the state now has jurisdiction over. So urban beekeeping is exploding in America right now.
Really?
And Florida is at the forefront of that. We've gone from 1,000 beekeepers registered about 5 years ago to, let's say it's early, about 3,200.
I'm not sure how my neighbors would look at a hive in my yard and say,
Most of
we
them,
get some.
most of them look just like you're looking right now, Bill. They're a little, you know, worried. But once you explain to them that how gentle your bees are and how calming sometimes they are, it's amazing. Then they get interested, and now they're competing with your bees. But one nice part about having bees in your backyard is by you having bees in a rural residential area, you're helping also defend off the African bees that would have to compete against your healthy bees, because you're going to be taking care of them, managing them by, you know, what the
But I'd have to
management
learn what
technique.
chemicals to give them to keep these bees healthy, right?
We actually have a good program going on, also by Dr. Jamie Ellis. It's called the Master Bee Program, and we also have the University of Florida has a bee college that goes on throughout the state. Excellent educational program.
Maybe one of these days we ought to get him on and have him talk with us.
absolutely.
Excellent
Sure, he'd love to.
speaker. But bees are not like you just thought, you know, they'll come out and attack you. And right now you have the right to own a hive of bees and place it in your backyard. And It's amazing how many women and other organizations are doing that now. Women
I would have
are
no
our
objection
biggest-
if one of my neighbors
Yeah.
had one. Not at
Yeah.
all. All my neighbors watching, you want to put out bees? I'll have it. I'll bring my own jars for the honey.
Yep. That is one of the big benefits, getting a jar of honey and giving it to your neighbors. They love.
But I
you bring
suppose you got to be very careful about how much honey you take out of the hive and how much you leave for
Correct.
them, right?
Yeah, you do. We always say with the different boxes, you have the big box, which is where the brood is, where the bees develop. And then you have the supers above that, and which are the smaller boxes. And we always say just leave one of those boxes for the bees, and you can take the rest.
Oh, really?
Because here in Florida, we don't have the winter like they do up north, where you've got to wait 3 or 4 months of snow and wonder if your beehive's still alive. Here, I always like to say they work 13 months out of the year, and they take Christmas off, but that's just so they can enjoy the family. And it's unique in a beehive because, talking about family, all of the sisters in there, all the worker bees are all half sisters, and all the brothers in there, they're all related directly to the queen, but they don't have a father. They've got a grandfather.
Yep.
Really?
So,
It's a lesson in genetics for sure when you go into a hive.
It's fascinating. There is so much to learn about a simple little creature.
Yep.
that's
You
how
wonder,
I
you
started
look around
6
the
years
world and
ago.
you say, wow.
Or 6 years. At 6 years of age, that's why I got interested in them, and just.
Out of
fell in
curiosity,
love.
how many times have you been stung?
I
You have
knew
any
that.
idea?
I knew that question was coming up. Probably well in the 100,000s of times. And
Woo!
Yeah. When anybody
not
asks-
all at once.
No, when everybody asks that question, I always say where,
Yeah.
because we get stung all over. Over time, a lot of people when they get stung, they'll swell up, which leads a lot of people to believe that they're allergic to bees when really they're not. It's just it's a
My
reaction.
sister has to carry around.
Yeah, the EpiPens, that's when
Although she has a hive, so
Okay.
I can't. Linda, why are you doing this?
You can take precautions.
Yeah.
But over the years, you actually lose the sensitivity to it. It still hurts a little bit, but it's just part of
That's
beekeeping.
really why we're swollen up. We're not really as big.
Yeah, I'll go with
All
that.
right, I'm going with that. We'll take that. All right. David, Mark, it's so good to have you. Please tell Commissioner Putnam that I appreciated your coming down here with us, and I look forward to having you back one of these days to tell us we won the battle and maybe talk a little more,
hope so.
or maybe bring on the gentleman you talked about.
Jamie Ellis would be an excellent person to bring on.
I thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Bill Hodges. This is Spotlight on Government. You're unique, you're special, and you're great. Tell yourself so often because you are, and we'll see you on the next Spotlight on Government. And David, Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.